It is not necessary to rob life of its mystery in order to understand it. I grew up in the country, and I used to dig in a clay bank where I thought it was buried treasure, and I wanted to be an archaeologist. What I was finding really was in an old garbage dump. I was finding pieces of pottery and stuff that people had thrown away probably 50 years before. But to me, it was wonderful to find these things, and so I got really interested in digging, and I'm still digging. In I think the second or third grade, we had a teacher come in. In those days, they didn't have an art teacher. They had someone who traveled around from school to school like a circuit preacher. And this woman came one day and she said, cover your paper with any colors that you want. Just make colors. And then when we did that, she said, now cover it with a black crayon. So we did that, and then she handed us a paper clip or something sharp and said, now start scratching out your picture. Well, that was exciting to everybody in my class, but it excited me beyond that day. I kept doing it for weeks after that, and I'm still doing it. In a sense, it's the root of all of my layering and unlayering, and it has a lot to do with texture. Essentially, I go into a nonverbal world. And when I was young, I used to think perhaps I was insane, so I didn't tell anyone that I would go hours without having a verbal thought. Now, in my later years, I realize there are people who spend their lifetime trying to reach that state. And it's basically a state of meditation. And some other people like to call it being in the zone, all these different tags. But for me, making art is a natural part of my life, so I don't separate it out so much. But it is not a time for me to be thinking. It's a time for me to be experiencing, if you wish. Now, color, I mean, no artist can be uninterested in color, even if they're working in grays, because color is it's sort of the music of the soul for a painter. To say my color is symbolic, I don't think so, except that it relates to nature. Like I said, I grew up in nature. And so my work's been referred to as psychological landscapes. It's certainly not specific landscapes, but it's about nature, for sure. I started out like most young artists, thinking that you had to do figurative and descriptive work. And so I did still lives and figures, and they were pretty awful. But 3 or 4 years into it, I started thinking I'd rather go inward than look outward, because actually it was more challenging. And so that began my sort of quest to go inside and let the images take care of themselves. So I'm not sure that I could say I explore ideas. I explore mysteries. Painters get asked all the time about what does this thing mean, whereas musicians don't. I can't imagine someone asking Mozart, what does this mean? And I think the problem starts when we're little children and people read to us from children's books and point to something and say, this is a duck. And pretty soon we assume, subconsciously anyway, that things don't have meaning unless you can assign words to them. You'll notice when little children make art, they make abstract art, but the adults ask, what is that? Is that a house? And the kid will eventually say, yes, that's a house, because they think they please the person who's asking them. But I would rather remain in that free, childlike state where I make images and not worry about what they mean, but rather whether they have any kind of presence. I had a history of printmaking long before Harvey came along. And I was fascinated by printmaking because not just because you could make multiple images, but because you made it in a different way. So when you make a lithograph or you make an etching, it's not the same thing as a painting. And I was already fascinated by that when Jane Kessler at the Mint Museum contacted me and said that she had a grant from the National Endowment to have artists come up to Harvey Littleton's studio and make prints. And I said, well, how do you make prints in a glass studio? And it was explained to me that you could print on glass. And I said, well, let's go. I kept going back because the medium itself was fairly new. And so we were still making discoveries about what you could do on glass. And I was intrigued with the transparency of glass, and also having made many etchings in color where the ink is transformed by the contact with copper, and it changes the color, not necessarily in a great way. It sort of dulls it down. And all of a sudden on glass, the color was completely pure because there's no interaction between the ink and the glass. Each time I went up, we would try a different way of affecting the glass, and using acid on some of them, using sandblasting, carving with sort of linear general type tools into it. So there was a lot you could do, and it kept each artist who came would lend their own experience to it. So it was growing as the artist collaborated with the studio and also with each other. I think collaboration is the way we communicate and the way we grow, and there's no reason why it shouldn't happen in art as well. The problem is people's egos get in the way, and so sometimes collaboration is threatening to people, but I enjoyed it. Every print shop I ever worked in, from Tamron to Harvey's to Lakeside in Michigan, there's always something that someone gives you that you didn't have before. And a wide communication between the printer and the artist is important, because the printer is also an artist of sorts. I never made my print. I mean, that sounds funny, but I never printed them. I always worked with master printers. And so I was open to their ideas as well. You know, we might darken this, you might try that. You know, and if I didn't like it, I didn't do it. But otherwise, it's just sort of communication that you would have with anybody on any subject.
Were you affected by the people and landscape in Littleton Studios? Was that unique, or did it affect your artwork in a way that was different than your other studio practices?
You know, I think everything affects your artwork. Each person you meet, each place you see new, you just don't necessarily know at the time how it's going to be. It all goes into the subconscious, and it comes out when it combines with other experiences and creates, I guess, what would be unique to each artist. So I don't think you are unaffected by anything you experience. I mean, when I spent a week in the Amazon, I came back using green, which I rarely use. And, you know, my response to when people ask me about that is you can't go to the Amazon without being affected by green. I mean, it sort of redefines green. And when I spent a week in Alaska, in the deep of winter, it sort of redefined white. And so those kind of natural experiences are almost more directly related, in the sense that I could see at the time that it was affecting me. But like all the others, it ultimately funnels into the subconscious and comes out whenever it's ready.
I discovered that your work was chosen to be included in the first exhibition of contemporary American artists to be presented in the former USSR. Could you explain what that experience was like and why, if that was important to you?
The trip to the Soviet Union was interesting. I had been there before, but most of the artists on the show, on the trip, had not been there. And so there was a lot of ego involved in artists not accepting the conditions of the Soviet Union being different than they are in the States. So rather than get into all that, which would go on forever, I was fascinated with the response of the then Russian people to our show. And first of all, the government, which had allowed, obviously, this show to go forward. It was sponsored by the Union of Soviet Artists, who are highly controlled. But the government was threatened by the show as well because, obviously Americans coming in with free thinking and so forth, it is just not comfortable for them. So the upshot of that was there was no advertisement whatsoever, no publicity, no one was told about the show. And when we found that out, I thought, well, we're just going to be standing there at the opening with nobody. Well, it turns out everything in the Soviet Union in those days was word of mouth, including rock music, and everything else got passed around by sort of bogus tapes that people would tape and retape and so forth. The same thing with this. There were 10,000 people the first day, and they had to pay a ruble to get in, so they didn't come free. And their response was overwhelming. I mean, we would stand by our pieces, and they would just come up and hug us. It was very emotional, a lot of tears. And, it was just heartwarming to me that they would spend their money, which they didn't have a lot of, to come see our art without anyone promoting it. And of course, I had some fascinating experiences during that week, because instead of doing what we were supposed to do, we were supposed to visit with the Union of Soviet Artists, which is very conservative. But one of the other artists on the trip and myself decided we were going to strike out on our own, and so we went to visit underground artists. And although it was a little bit dicey, it was really exciting to see some of the things we saw and to be taken in some of the I say underground, but many of the times we were taken down into basements, places where people secretly produced work. And that was a very interesting experience.
Could you talk a little bit more about the development of your ideas and techniques over time?
Usually I leave that to other people, for the simple reason that for me, I'm just doing my work. And so someone will say, well, it's changed so much from the last show you did or whatever. I say, well, you can judge that. I don't even think in those terms. I just do it. Color comes and goes. In the 70s and early 80s, my color was very atmospheric. Then it got away from that. And now the atmospheres have sort of come back. And those are the things I notice, but I don't really see it so much as anything other than a continuum. I go to work, and that's what happens. I don't pre-think anything. When I start a painting, I don't know where it's going to go, and don't ever want to know.